So this video is going to help you understand chapter 6 from Naysay, which is all about planting the naysayer. So the official title of the chapter is Skeptics May Object. The word skeptic and the word naysayer are the same thing. It's basically the idea of deliberately putting somebody's voice who disagrees with you smack into the middle of your paper. And so we're going to talk about why you might want to do that, some techniques for how you do that, and some techniques to avoid so that you don't do it poorly. So as usual, we're going to be following along also with my notes so that you can pay attention to certain things in both the text and just some ideas that I want you to think about. So the chapter starts off with telling you reasons why you should want to plant a no voice into your paper. And the first thing that they remind you of is that incorporating the critical views of others, so incorporating voices that disagree with you, actually enhances your credibility. It makes you more credible to your readers. And this might seem backwards to some of you because you think, well, why am I allowing anybody to challenge my thoughts? If my thoughts are that good, I'm not going to let anybody challenge them. And that's really a backwards way to look at it. You come off as more intelligent, more open-minded, more thoughtful if you have honestly listened to the voices of your critics and then you show that you are ready to answer them. So listening to others carefully, especially listening to people who disagree with you, is a highly sought-after skill in argumentation, and it is what determines the best quality paper. Graf and Birkenstein also want to remind you that the more you give voice to your critics' objections, right, the more you say the things that you know that people don't like about your idea, the more you can disarm them, right? And disarm is a verb that means you're taking away their power. You're taking away the weapons that they have against you. Recognize their weapons and then use those ideas as a springboard in a conversation about why your ideas are still better. I like the fact that they remind you that using a naysayer is respectful to your readers because you're treating them like they are smart people. You are basically confident enough to lay your ideas out in front of them and say, you know what? Some people challenge me on this. Here's my response to those challengers. And then you're trusting that your audience is still going to follow along with you. Even though you're going to give voice to your critics, you still have enough confidence in yourself and enough confidence in your audience that you believe that they're going to follow along and agree with you in what you're saying. Some people don't respect their audience well enough for that, and they just spoon feed them what they think they need to hear because they don't trust that that audience is going to follow them. Planting the naysayer well shows that you trust your audience as critical thinkers. And this is true, it allows you to add link to your essays. And I don't know how many of you paid attention to this, but by the time we got to about, somewhere here, they said it helped, a lot of their students say it helps them to meet their page length requirements, and that's a good thing for you. Some of you that struggle with short in-class essays, so like an FRQ style essay for AP Lang, if you never have enough length for your arguments, you might want to try putting in a naysayer on purpose because it'll give you something to talk about. It'll give you something to move your ideas forward with, right? So at this point, they start sharing techniques for how you do this. And remember, as usual in Graf and Birkenstein's work, they start with the most general and then they move into stuff that's more specific and challenging in terms of how you do it technique-wise. So the first thing you can do is just attribute ideas to, in general, call them skeptics, call them readers, call them many people. It's like the equivalent of the standard view from chapter 1. There are lots of reasons why you might want to just refer to people as a skeptic. Okay? Sometimes, just like that standard view from chapter 1, there are so many different people that hold this idea that you don't want to point one out in particular. And so it's just easier for you to talk about the basic, some readers or some people or many people might object. Okay? However, if you do know a specific group, name it, right? It says naysayers can be labeled, and it adds precision to your writing and impact to your writing by directly identifying what group you're talking about. So in my notes under part B, I say if you know who it is, label them. But when you are labeling them, be very specific in identifying that group. So Graf and Berkenstein recognize that some people don't like to be labeled, right? And labels can be used inappropriately. So make sure that you're very clear about exactly who has this idea. If it's not all feminists, but it's a certain group of feminists, then make sure you use those qualifying adjectives as you identify them. You can also put in what I call hedging language. And the hedging language templates are right here. Although not all Christians think alike, and that would probably be true because there are millions of people on the planet that identify as Christians, right? But not all of them are from the same denomination. Look at all the variety of churches we have just in Geneseo. So not all Christians think alike. But in general, some of them are probably going to dispute my claim, right? Look at this one, non-native English speakers. This simply means people who can speak English, but they didn't grow up speaking English. Well, this could be anywhere from a non-native English speaker who grew up in China, a non-native English speaker who grew up in the United States but didn't speak English, a non-native English speaker who lives in Norway, right? So it's saying just in general, if you didn't grow up speaking English, right? So it's hard to generalize about them, but a large part of this group is probably going to say that. So this would be hedging language, and sometimes that can be good so it can soften the blow of a label, right? You can also choose in your naysayer technique to be more informal if the audience purpose and tone allow it to be. And so one of the two ways that you can do this is by just using rhetorical questions. So instead of naming a group, you sort of become the voice itself by asking these questions. And sometimes you can even use first-person language in order to frame these rhetorical questions. And so you've got some examples of templates right here. You know, is my proposal realistic? What are the chances that my proposal is going to be adopted? Is it always true, as I've been suggesting? So frame the question that people are thinking, but just sort of voice it in your own voice. The other thing you can do is let your naysayer speak directly. And what they mean by this is actually make dialogue. Actually make dialogue. Now, this is different than using a quote, though you can certainly at this point choose to quote a naysayer, right? If you know somebody and you know the exact words that they used in order to create that idea, you can certainly actually quote somebody and then challenge that quote. What they're talking about here, though, is kind of making up dialogue. And you can tell they're making it up because they're just using this label of some in general. So it's kind of a standard view, but they're putting that standard view into words, almost like you're reading a story, right? Or you're reading a play. And there's this really good excerpt from an article from the beginning of the 20th century when people didn't or still had the opportunity to smoke in restaurants. And that's what we were arguing about, is whether or not smoking bans should come into play. And you can see right here how he puts this voice of the anti-smokers into a dialect. You have to be careful, though, because if you read this paragraph and you think about it, this voice literally sounds like this. Get over it, say the anti-smokers. You're the minority. So you can hear the tone in it. But if you're aware of people who are trying to get other people to stop smoking, honestly, they have that sort of snippy tone to them. So this is not inappropriate for what's going on. Smoking kills. That's really how some people speak to each other. So you have to make sure that it's appropriate, that this is the way that you do it. But if you do have that sort of more relaxed, informal tone, then it's kind of an interesting way to put the naysayer into dialogue. So Graf and Berkenstein not only tell you how to do this, but they also give you some warnings, because you can do the naysayer poorly. And when you do it poorly, it could actually make your paper worse. So we're down here in represent objections fairly. And you'll notice, those of you who have read chapter 2, that it's referencing chapter 2 right here from pages 31 and 32 about Peter Elbow's believing game. And remember, the believing game was about summarizing other people's words so that you cannot recognize bias in the summary sentences. Not in your I say, but in the summary sentences. Now remember, this is about credibility. If you can do a nice job of summarizing accurately what the other group thinks, then you are going to come off as more credible. If you are simply sounding nasty and negative in tone about what your opponent thinks, then your credibility actually goes down the tubes, right? The other thing you don't want to do is just go so fast so that you don't take the time to really think about their ideas. So they say, like, don't hurry past it, or just sort of dump the idea in the reader's lap but move on. I believe Graff and Birkenstein even say take your time and write a few paragraphs about it, right? Write a few paragraphs so that you can really get into what it is that they want to say. They also warn you not to alienate readers by starting to mock people. Because if you begin mocking your opposition, theoretically your opposition is what you're still trying to convince. So mocking the opposition does not convince the opposition. It makes them want to stop reading your essay. People who mock the opposition are not writing for the opposition. They're writing for their own best buddies. You want to have more influence than that, and you want to get people who are not on your side to come on your side. So it's really important that you avoid that sort of hostile mocking that is very prominent in our political culture today. You also want to avoid saying, well, that's wrong or that's dumb. And we can see that happening on page 87. You are really just bullying your audience. So I think that this is important for you to think about. You don't want to just tell them, because partially the problem is you're not offering your own supporting reasons. And so that's just not good argumentation on your part. But you are gently, or you're trying to push them by just telling them, well, that's stupid, and that's not a good idea. You need to have some way that you can potentially, ideally, find common ground. And so one of the things that they remind you of is that using this yes but pattern is really a good advantage for you. And they show you how to do that here. So remember, the yes but pattern was a specific form of the okay but. But when you are reading for naysayers and you see people do this, oftentimes you will see this sort of yes but response. You're finding common ground with that naysayer, but ultimately you're saying, no, I disagree with you. And so it is really important that you get the order correct. You can't bark at them and say, oh, I disagree, and then be like, well, but they have a point. Now you've confused your audience. It really has to be in this yes but pattern. If you're going to find a concession with them, find it first, and then harp on how you think your ideas are better, right? So we've got some templates here for how you can use that yes but pattern after you've introduced the naysayer, so that you can see how it can work for you. At the end of the chapter, it also gets into the idea that you need to make sure that your response to the objection is better than the objection itself. If you don't have a really good answer for that objection, then you probably shouldn't be addressing it in your paper, because it's not going to do anything to help you. And if you're really stuck and you keep thinking and thinking and thinking about that naysayer, and you can't get that naysayer out of your head, and you realize, oh my gosh, I totally agree with the opposition. They tell you very gently, it's okay to change your mind, right? It's okay to change your mind, because in academia, right, in college, in the idea of learning and getting an education, if you have looked at these thoughts carefully and you've gone through a deliberative process, and in your own thought process you've come to your own conclusion that you now realize is different than the conclusion you started with, then the academic exercise is successful. It's okay. You just might have to rework your ideas in your paper to make sure that your thesis now agrees with what you're talking about. All right. I think that's it We will be trying to point out naysayers as we read various texts, and I will try to give you some examples so that you can see it in context. This is a really useful skill that I'm going to make sure that you demonstrate in your own writing.